Okay, you are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHW WPPM. Tonight on the program, we'll be joined by Councilmember Jamie Gaudier. Our own Lance Haver will provide a report on medical debt. And Denise Clay Murray will tell us about the speaker races in Pennsylvania and the United States Congress. Lance, how are you tonight?
I'm all right. Happy New Year to you and Denise and all of our viewers.
And Happy New Year to you too. And Denise, how are you doing tonight?
I'm good. I'm good. At 8 o'clock, I will be back watching the Speaker of the House race in DC, which I'm sure will provide lots and lots of comedy and me without popcorn.
And we are going to talk about that later in the show. But I just have to, I'll throw this question out there and we don't have to answer it now. Is it more foolish that they've done 6 votes and gotten almost the exact same result, or is it more foolish that I've watched all 6? So we can we can debate that internally. But before we get to that, Lance, I want to hear what you have to tell us about medical debt.
So this is an issue that continues to become a very significant part of people's lives. Medical debt is just something that is overwhelming for many, many Americans. And one of the things that's very exciting is a number of cities in America have decided to use some of the COVID dollars, the money that's coming from the federal government that's supposed to help cities, states, and counties overcome the damages that were created by the COVID, and buy up the medical debt and put it aside. So one of the things that we're going to look at is how is that working and how is that going to help or hurt Philadelphia, and what will it do in Philadelphia? And I think I need a little bit of help trying to get the slideshow up on the screen. Yeah, thank you very much. So the question really is, will Philadelphia join other cities? There are less progressive cities in the country who have already gone out and purchased old medical debt and are in the process of eliminating it. And so this is from the New York Times. The medical debt is being erased in Toledo, Ohio. And as most of us know, Ohio is a state that very heavily went for President Trump, not a progressive state at all. And Cook County, Illinois, which is where Chicago is. These are 2 examples, but they're not the only example. It's also happening in New Orleans, Louisiana, and it's happening in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But as so far, it's not happening in Philadelphia. And what we're looking at is literally tens of thousands of people are going to be opening up their mailboxes in these cities, and they're going to get a letter saying your medical debt has been eliminated, and that you no longer will have to worry about it. It will no longer appear on your credit report. It will no longer get in the way of you buying a home, buying a car, renting, or anything else. And again, these cities are using the federal dollars from the American Recovery Act. And they're using that money not only to help fill the budget holes, but they're using, in these cities, they're using that money to help citizens who became ill and couldn't pay for all the medical bills. And the money comes from the federal act. And that money was put there just specifically for these type of reasons. The city of Philadelphia, like many other cities, is getting a tremendous amount of money. In total, Philadelphia will get $1.4 billion. Again, I'm going to say that number, $1.4 billion from the American Rescue Act to help Philadelphians and the city overcome all the problems that were created by the COVID and the shutdown that followed COVID. And you can see this actually comes from the city's webpage itself. The city goes through it and says, this is how much money we're going to get in 2022, which we've already gotten, 2023, 24, and 25. And the total is $1.4 billion. And we know that the majority of that money has yet to be spent. And the city of Philadelphia, in the budgets coming up, will be able to decide how to use that money. Medical debt is pervasive. it's all over the place. It's hard to talk to people without finding that either they or someone they know have had a problem paying their medical debt. 17.8% of people who have a credit report filed have medical debt in collections on that report. And we think that number is low because not all of that shows up yet. So people who were ill during COVID and have not been able to pay all the copays or were not able to pay all the bills, they haven't shown up yet on the credit reports. We think that that 17.8% number is going to increase in the next couple of years. We don't know, that's projection. But what we can say right now is there's 100 million people in the United States have medical debt. 17.8% of the people have that medical debt today showing up on their collections. The average amount was $2,424. We also know that most of us don't have that type of savings. That would be literally impossible for people to write a check to cover that amount. And as you can see from this, medical debt is a significant problem. There are people who owe $10,000 in debt or more. Over 70% of the people who owe medical debt owe over $10,000.
Can you explain that graph a little bit, Lane? It's a little hard to see.
Okay, so this is a chart that shows how much is owed by a person who owes medical debt. And the total number is $195 billion. That's what we all owe collectively.
Wow.
But most of that money, over 70% of that money, that $195 million, is owed by people who owe over $10,000. And the significance of that is these are people who cannot pay for the debt on their credit card. They can't pay for the debt by borrowing from friends and relatives. It's not like somebody says, my car broke down, can you help me out? I have to raise a couple $100 to pay the mechanic or to buy the new tire, or I'll put it on my credit card. When someone has a $10,000 medical debt, that's going to continue to show up on their credit report, and we're going to go over it, but that's going to affect almost every aspect of their life, from how much they pay for car loans and mortgages, to how much they pay on their credit card interest rate, to getting a job, to being able to rent an apartment. So this chart just gives you an idea that the amount of money that's owed isn't that someone forgot to pay a bill, or it isn't that somebody has an easy way of solving the problem. It's that it's an overwhelming problem for literally hundreds of thousands of Americans. And America's unique in that. We know that most countries have a national health care plan where all of the bills are paid for. And this is a chart that tries to explain why we have such a problem in America. Perhaps this is also hard to read, so let me go over what this chart is. This chart shows people where the largest copay, what out-of-pocket expenses are from. The largest country in the industrialized world is Switzerland, with $1,577. On average, the average person has to pay $1,577. The next highest expense out of pocket is the United States, with $1,315. So this is the average. Anybody who has less means that somebody has more. And these out-of-pocket expenses are the copays. So when you go to the doctor, even if you have health insurance, the health insurance doesn't pay everything. There's an amount that you have to pay the copay, and that is what the majority of medical debt is from. It's from people who don't have health insurance at all because they can't afford it. It's mostly, though, from people who have health insurance, but the health insurance they have doesn't cover everything. And this is not for elective surgery. Elective surgery, doctors who do elective surgery, like plastic surgery, for example, they make the patient prepay, or they make the patient finance it. So this is an example of people who get sick, who are injured, who have an accident, and go to the hospital or go to the doctor and are left over with this medical debt. Healthcare also drives bankruptcy. And this is from an organization which we're going to talk about again later, the RIP Medical Debt, a nonprofit that helps buy up debt with donations and eliminate it. 1 in 2 Americans, they find, choose between paying medical bills and covering basic needs. Nearly 50% of us choose not to get medical care because we simply don't have enough money. 50% of us wouldn't be able to afford an unexpected $500 medical bill. And 2/3, 66% of the bankruptcies in America are driven by medical debt, by the copays, by unexpected medical bills. And this is what we're looking at. The effects of healthcare debt. If you owe healthcare debt and it shows up on your credit report and gives you a lower credit report number, the cost of a mortgage, a car loan, and even your credit card goes up. The cost of homeowners insurance and car insurance goes up. Many landlords look at credit reports before they decide who to rent to. So if you've been in an accident, if you've been sick, if you haven't been able to make your copay and your credit score goes down, you may have a very significant problem finding an apartment. In what I consider scary, employers are now looking at your credit score to decide whether you're trustworthy. And because the way credit scores work in America right now, the whole credit report doesn't show up. What you get is a number. So these businesses, these employers who are looking to hire you, they don't know whether you owe the money because you were making bad decisions or because you got sick. In addition, if you owe medical debt, there's a good chance your doctor won't continue to see you. And there's a good chance that the people who buy up the debt collectors, the people whose business it is to buy debts for pennies on a dollar, will go ahead then and file a suit against you. Now, we're lucky in Pennsylvania that the debt collectors are not allowed to garnish wages. It's illegal for the private debt collector to garnish wages in Pennsylvania. Only the IRS can do that. But in other states, that's a real possibility. If a judgment's filed against you, the person who has that judgment can go to your employer and get part of your paycheck. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in. Medical debt is sold. Now, this is a complicated concept. Some hospitals try and collect their own debt, but there are formulas in place with the federal government and the state governments that reimburse hospitals for uncollected bills. So hospitals, in some cases, have an economic incentive to write off the debt and then collect that money from the federal or state government and then sell that debt for pennies on a dollars to a bill collector, a debt collector. And what we find, and we study this and we look at it, we find for every $10 of the American Rescue Fund spent in other cities, $1,000 worth of medical debt can be erased. If the city of Philadelphia uses 1% of the federal grant to help citizens overcome the damages caused by COVID, just 1% of that money that's been allocated to help citizens deal with the fallout from the COVID epidemic, $14 billion in medical bills will be eliminated. Again, I'm going to say that as clearly as I can. If the city of Philadelphia tomorrow passed a bill that allocated 1% of the money that's been sent from the federal government to help the city deal with the fallout from COVID, use 1% of that to help people overcome and eliminate medical debt, $14 billion in medical bills would be eliminated. And that money, of course, would then recirculate into the city and it would help the economy. People who have been burdened and not been able to buy a home, buy a car, not been able to afford homeowners insurance or car insurance would have higher credit scores and be in a much better position. It's not a panacea. It's not a magic wand. Doesn't solve everything. But it is a very significant type of help that we are very able to do with almost no resources. 1%, that leaves 99% for them to give tax breaks to the businesses, for them to give tax breaks to developers, for them to do everything they want. 1% is all that we need to eliminate $14 billion in medical bills. And that would be a very significant help. In a city where we say that we are trying to do what we can to lift people out of poverty, it's almost an embarrassment that in Ohio, a conservative state that elected John Kasich as governor, and voted for President Trump not once but twice, is ahead of us in helping its citizens overcome medical debt. Now, it's great that this is the direction the country is going in, but it is of interest to us as part of the Lenfest Foundation's Next Mayor project to ask, where are the mayoral candidates on this? Which candidates are going to support using the COVID dollars to help our citizens overcome medical debt? And which candidates are going to say, no, we want to use that money only for tax breaks, only for developers, only to help businesses. And that's really the balancing act that the next mayor is going to have to look at. How much of these resources are we going to use to help people directly? And how many of these resources are we going to put into something I consider has already failed, which is a trickle-down model, saying if we give it to wealthy people, it'll trickle down to poor people eventually. And that's the balancing act. Now, because of the holidays, I wasn't able to get responses from all the candidates. Hopefully next week, I'll be able to make a report and tell everyone which of the candidates say, yes, we should take 1% of that money, buy down medical debt, and eliminate it. People can open up their mail and get a letter saying, congratulations, the city of Philadelphia knows that you fell behind because of COVID, knows that you couldn't make all the medical payments, and now the city of Philadelphia stepped in, bought that debt, and eliminated it. Go out, buy a house, buy a car, help out the local economy. Make sure that you're a full participant. So that's what we hopefully are going to find out from the candidates in the week ahead.
Now, here's my question, Lance. If it only requires 1% of the money that we're getting from federal COVID dollars, we have a city budget in the billions, and much of that money is being wasted on totally innocuous stuff. Philadelphia could have done this well before COVID. Why hasn't it, I wonder?
Well, I agree. It's a great question. And it's really a question that hopefully some of the council people who have left office to run for mayor will have a better answer for. I can say that there's a slight difference in that the revenue base, the taxes that go to the city, were never allocated to deal with medical issues like the COVID dollars are. So you could make an argument that this is the first time in the last 20, 25 years that money has been allocated directly to help people who got sick during an epidemic. We have in my memory, we have never done anything like this before. Whether you're a big supporter of President Biden and the old Congress or not, it is an unusual advancement for the federal government to say COVID caused very significant problems for local economies, but also for people. People became ill. Some people, unfortunately, passed away. But many people who became ill are left with medical bills that they can't pay. So the connection between the money to help people with the fallout from COVID and using that money to do away with the medical debt, to me, is a direct connection that didn't exist prior to the money coming here. So I think the real question is, why aren't we doing it now? And why we didn't do it before. It might have been more of a reach, but now it's no reach at all. It's just a logical conclusion. COVID made many of us ill, left many of us with medical bills. We can use that money to erase the debt.
And, when we're talking about the poorest big city in America, right? Mm-hmm. It's a very short walk from I didn't have insurance or I was underinsured. I became injured or ill. I can't pay the entire debt. It goes on my credit report, which is relatively modern invention. These didn't exist 50 years ago. It goes on my credit report, and it affects almost every aspect of my life, and I have very little control over that. One of the ways we get people out of poverty is we help them with this crushing debt that, in some cases, they didn't do anything wrong. It was just bad luck. And, in a society that claims to be civilized, we can't let things like that happen to people.
I mean, especially since everyone's been talking about canceling student loan debt. And the argument that I get the most from people when I tell them, why don't we focus on medical debt because it impacts more people? Oh, well, you can file for bankruptcy with medical debt. But the thing is, that stays on your credit report for 7 years, if not more. Yep. and it
Yeah.
keeps you from moving forward with your life. And it's based totally on something you had no power over. When I was in the hospital for a month because my diabetes ran amok, it was because I couldn't get health insurance because every time I called someone and tried to buy health insurance, I mentioned I was a diabetic, and in the case of Independence Blue Cross, they literally hung up on me. And two, I didn't have enough money to cover all of my medication, so I could have avoided that. And since I had no insurance, everything that they needed to treat me was in the hospital, so I had to stay there with it. And the medical debt that I am still, in fact, I got a call about my medical bill just 2 weeks ago asking me to pay this last 5 grand off. Because even if you do get charity care or some kind of assistance, there's still a knot you're responsible for. Um, like I said, I just got a call about mine like literally 2 weeks ago. And I've started paying it down, but I'm lucky. I recognize that I'm lucky enough to be able to do that. Not everybody is.
Right. And that's, again, where we'll have to see what our government decides to do.
Mhm.
Again, I want to point out that we didn't have any difficulty bailing out the businesses that had to close down. And I agree, we should have done that. We didn't have any problems bailing out the independent workers who were not able to work. We didn't have any problem helping everybody, all the businesses and all the developers who suffered because of the COVID restrictions. Now the question is, will we help the people who became ill during COVID pay their medical bills? Will we have the same empathy for our citizens as we have for our businesses?
All right. Well, Lance, thank you very much for that report. And we'll look forward to the follow-up when we hear from the mayoral campaigns about where they stand on this. And on January 19th, City Council will start up again for its spring session. There's a lot that's going to happen this session, so we're going to have some interviews with different council members leading up to the 19th and past the 19th a little bit. Today on the program, we're going to have our interview with Councilmember Jamie Gaudier discussing what her goals are for the spring term. So here's our interview with Councilmember Gaudier. Jamie Gaudier, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about what I think is a significant package of legislation that you proposed in the last session called the People's Preservation Package?
Yeah, so the People's Preservation Package is an effort to preserve valuable, affordable housing across Philadelphia. I think you all know that we've been experiencing a housing crisis in Philadelphia for a long time. If we look at across the city at, in particular, housing units that are made affordable through time-limited subsidies. We have about 5,400 of those units that will have their subsidies expire in the next 5 years across the city. 900 of those are in the 3rd District in West and Southwest. And if you look across the city to 10 years, that number doubles. So that's thousands of families that could be at risk of losing their affordable housing. And so the People's Preservation Package attempts to disrupt that dynamic. So one, it requires property owners to notify not only tenants, but other affordable housing providers and community groups, as well as the city, when they intend to end an affordable housing contract and sell their properties. It also requires that those property owners allow an opportunity for other affordable housing providers, the city or tenants to put up an offer to buy those properties before others who might not intend to keep them affordable are allowed to. And it also requires the city to keep a directory of housing units that are backed by time-limited subsidies so that we have more time to figure out what we do to save those units, and so that we have more time to hopefully develop a plan to save, those thousands of units and keep them in service as affordable housing at a time when our city critically needs that. And lastly, it also calls for a hearing in the Housing Committee on Section 8 voucher discrimination. We know that every day people are doing their best to use Section 8 vouchers to find affordable housing, but 65% of landlords are not accepting vouchers. And so we have this critical tool to help people find affordable housing, but those same people are being discriminated against in the private housing market, which is illegal. And so we want to have a hearing to look at these discriminatory practices and to see what we can do at a city level or at other levels of government to bring that to an end, because everybody deserves affordable housing. So for us, this is a very critical package that reflects, what's going on in the city, and it is attempting to find an equitable and just solution.
And that voucher piece, I think, is really important. I think you told me about that a while ago, that there's this broad discrimination against Section 8 vouchers that I was not aware of at the time. And
yep,
one of the things you read a lot about when we talk about housing is, well, more Section 8 vouchers, and then you realize, well, no, that's not an answer right now, because there's so many people who don't accept them. So that's very interesting here. Do you know, is there any idea when the hearings might be scheduled?
I know we are going to have the hearing sometime this spring, but we don't have an exact date yet.
Okay, it's very interesting. We're gonna be following up on that. I think it's really important. So when we talk about, now let's look forward a little bit. What are you looking forward to this spring in terms of the legislative agenda for you and City Council?
Sure. Well, the housing package that I talked about will be a big piece of what we're focused on and getting that across, those bills across the finish line. Beyond that, gun violence, I've focused on gun violence as a priority issue since I started in office in 2020. I continue to push the Kennedy administration to develop a more urgent response. This session, I want to focus specifically on youth gun violence. We've been seeing more and more young people getting involved in acts of gun violence, whether as victims and also as perpetrators. At the same time, as a city, we haven't uncovered many prevention or intervention programs that are directly focused on youth who might be in a cycle of violence. And so I think that that's something that our city has to do more successfully if we're going to, remove people from young people from a cycle of violence and put them on the path to opportunity. So I intend to have a hearing this session specifically on youth involved in gun violence and better ways that our city can intervene in that activity. And I'm hoping to uncover solutions through that hearing that can inform, funding for youth gun violence initiatives and policy, as well as any budget implications. Additionally, this session, I'm also really focused on workforce development. So, the third district, West and Southwest in particular, is becoming a hub for the life sciences. So we're seeing millions of square feet of commercial space that has been developed or is in development. And it's my aim that Black and Brown West and Southwest Philadelphians in particular will be a part of that economic activity and will benefit from that economic activity. We've seen so many cities like, San Francisco or like, parts of Boston where the economy grew and people were pushed out. And I think here in Philadelphia, we have the opportunity to benefit from the growth of the life sciences sector while not displacing our residents. But we can only do that if we're very intentional about workforce development and training opportunities. And so while I think our city is very focused on the economic development piece, I don't think we're focused enough on the training piece, specifically for people in our neighborhoods. And I want to make that a focus of mine and City Council because West and Southwest Philadelphia is such a hub for that activity. And, I'll continue to focus on public spaces. That has been a big drive of mine since I've come into office. I've been able to direct millions of dollars to public spaces, specifically in Black and Brown neighborhoods, because I believe, our kids deserve the same amenities as kids who live in wealthier and whiter areas. One huge accomplishment for me last session that will carry into this one is that I was able to secure in total $3.5 million for the renovation of the Sayre pool. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this pool, but it's a huge Olympic-sized indoor pool in West Philadelphia that has been closed for years. It's owned by the school district, and it fell into disrepair some time ago. And it went from being this historic space that was open to our community, and also a space where we were able to train lifeguards who work across the city, to a closed asset at a time when gun violence and youth gun violence is soaring. And so I was able to, get council to commit $3.5 million towards the renovation of this pool. And my push this session is to get the school district to be a partner in committing about $4 million to get that pool open to the public. Enough is enough, and the community deserves this resource. And so that's a big push for me with respect to the Sayre pool, but also with respect to public spaces in general. And then lastly, I would say continuing my Just Services PHL push. So last year, I had a budget campaign called Just Services PHL, where I was really pushing on the administration to put resources in the budget that would allow us to serve our neighborhoods better, and in particular, Black and Brown neighborhoods suffering from gun violence. Every day, we're getting calls to the office about trash not being picked up, about illegal dumping that happens over and over and over again, about street lights being out in areas where there are shootings, about abandoned cars, about problem properties. I think during the pandemic, the city has really been struggling to deliver high quality services. But at the same time, we know that if we clean and green, blocks that are experiencing gun violence, we could see dramatic improvements, right? We can reduce shootings by 30% is shown if we concentrate cleaning and greening and other improvements on blocks that are really struggling. So my push through Just Services PHL was to get better and more dependable city services, and to have a targeting of those services in the communities that are most crippled by gun violence in this moment. And so I will bring back that campaign for the FY24 budget as well. So it'll be a pretty full session, but I'm excited about the things that I'm focused on.
Yeah, and that's a significant amount of work you're doing, specifically with the pool. When we're talking about youth gun violence, you have to give young people a place to go. Mm-hmm. And it just, that's it. So even though it's a little too early to do this yet, what I'm a little curious about, we're going to be in budget season soon enough. Is there a certain way you're approaching this year's budget hearings, given that there's a little bit more of a surplus and maybe a little bit more room? Are there certain things you're looking for?
Well, I think this year's budget will be important, right? We have a surplus, but we also have an outgoing mayor, and we have to make sure that our important priorities are shored up, right, going into 2024. And so that's the frame of mind that I'm going into this budget season with. And I think many of the things that I talked to you about, like from a policy perspective, also will have budget implications. We're going to have to make sure that we have adequate robust funding for affordable housing. That will continue to be a huge need in our communities. And that's something that I fought for every single budget. Just Services PHL, that makes this push on city services. We're going to have to make sure that we get money to the agencies that will allow them to deliver to our constituents in the way that they deserve. So that, that's money for streets, that's money, so that we can appropriately deal with illegal dumping and abandoned car removal. So making sure that city agencies are shored up. The workforce development piece is also something that I'll be looking towards. I think that our city has to invest in the training programs that are going to allow Black and Brown Philadelphians to be inside those new labs, to be inside those manufacturing facilities. As these new developments are popping up, I don't want our residents to be the ones, or just the ones in the mailroom, or just the ones, you know, that are on the construction site. We deserve to be a part of this new life sciences boom and to have the lucrative career pipelines that will come out of that. And I think the city is going to have to invest some resources in making sure that the training programs are available. And then gun violence. Every year since 2020, I've been a part of a coalition of council that has pushed for historic and record amounts of funding towards violence prevention and intervention initiatives. We've set a baseline that is not going to go away. And I think we also have to have an eye towards making sure that we're thinking specifically about youth that are involved in gun violence, and that those programs can, you know, adequately intervene in youth violence activity. So those are some of the things. Many of the things I'm looking at on the policy side also have a budget implication.
I'd like to bring in Denise Clay-Murray here on Philadelphia Moment.
Thanks, Larry. And thank you for joining us today, Council Member. We really appreciate it. I guess my question, and it kind of piggyback on what you were talking about in terms of money for gun violence prevention and the fact that that's a priority. One of the things that a lot of folks have been asking about is how effective has this money been? Has that discussion come up? And if so, what are you finding in terms of the effectiveness of this money?
First, I'll start by saying, I think it's really important to support the community groups that are on the ground doing violence prevention work. For many years, a lot of these groups have been doing work, kind of bootstrapping it, getting funding wherever they can, and I don't think that that's right. At the same time, I do think we need more and better data from the administration about how things are working. I know that they're working on that, and council's still waiting to see that. I also would like to see smaller grants go towards more grassroots efforts. One of the things that I didn't so much like about the infusion of money that we put into gun violence prevention is that we made these really super big and complicated grants. So most of that money went towards grants that were in the size of between the size of $100,000 and $1 million, which necessitated a pretty complicated grant application process. I think we need to get money in smaller amounts to really grassroots organizations that know the players, that can reach youth within their neighborhoods, and that can effectively stop or allay gun violence activity if they have more resources. And so I think that's something that we're still working towards, if I'm being honest. At the same time, I do firmly believe that we have to support credible people in the community who know this work and who are doing the work every day.
Okay, now, in terms of gun violence itself, everyone, at least on some level, can agree that there are root causes to gun violence, things like poverty and lack of opportunity and things like that. Is this, during this council session, do you see that being approached in terms of the budget? Because once upon a time, before the pandemic, Council President Clark had his moonshot for poverty, that he wanted to, get rid of poverty or at least reduce it in like a 4-year program. Does that come up this year, or what do you think should be done in terms of addressing the root causes of gun violence?
Sure. So I am a firm believer that our approach to gun violence has to go beyond enforcement. It has to be comprehensive, and it it has to include investments in the places that are most struggling from gun violence and the people who are directly involved. And it has to get at those root causes. And so through my work, here are a few ways that I'm trying to get at that. One, through the Just Services PHL campaign. If you look at the places where gun violence is happening, it's happening in areas that were redlined, and it's happening in areas that have been massively disinvested by government and other players for decades and decades and decades. And so to me, a key part of making those communities safe is investing in those communities and making them cleaner, greener, more beautiful, and with more access to opportunity within people's specific neighborhoods. The other piece of that, I think, is investing directly into the people. So for instance, with the hearing that I'm doing on youth gun violence, I'm trying to uncover what the sort of indicators are for young people that are getting involved in gun violence. Is it that they're truant? Is it that, they've been through the foster care system? Is it that, they went to the juvenile justice center and they never got any help to turn them, onto a different path when they came out of JJSC? I do agree with you that we have to zone in on the specific factors that are driving people towards violence, and we have to come up with solutions that will alleviate those factors. And it's worth our while to do that, right? It's worth our while to invest in people in a way that matters, because the cost of violence is enormous. It's an enormous cost and toll on the city. It's worth our while to make massive investments in neighborhoods that have been disinvested and are therefore seeing violence because of the enormous toll and cost of violence on the city of Philadelphia. And so I am going to certainly be focused on those root factors and how to more firmly get towards them so that we can eliminate violence in our city. And I think other council members are thinking the same way as well. There are several council members who've been really strong on gun violence traditionally. Councilmember Jones, Councilmember Johnson, the council president. So I think you'll see other people focusing on those root factors as well.
Now, this is an election year, whether we like it or not. You have the mayor and all the members of council that are up for re-election. And traditionally, that has made the actual practice of governing more interesting than it ought to be.
Okay.
Now, this is your first re-election, correct?
Yeah.
Have you gotten any advice from anyone on how to handle this intersection between politics and governance?
No, this is the first time that I'll be running as a sitting council member. So I kind of, I don't really know I don't have a full roadmap. I don't think there is a roadmap, or if there is, it hasn't been given to me, but I'd like to see it if it's there.
Okay, so do you think that because we are in that intersection of electoral politics and actual governance, that things will be harder to do on some level? And how do you personally, based on how you perceive or approach governance, approach that?
Things will be harder. One, I have an amazing staff team that I've been able to build up over the last several years. They believe in, the vision that I've set forward, and they're working really hard on it. And so if I'm being pulled, in certain ways, and I have a team here who is driving all of the work that I just described to you all. Secondly, I'm running on my work. I feel really proud of what I've been able to do over the last 3 years, and I'm confident that if I continue to do work that matters to the people, that I'm going to be here for the next term as well.
Okay. Well, thank you, council member. I'm turning you back over to Larry McGlynn, and you're listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5.
All right, well, Councilmember Jamie Gaudier, and I'm going to take a moment of personal privilege here. You're from the 3rd District, the best district, because that's where I live. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
All right, we'd like to thank Councilmember Jamie Gaudier for being with us on the program. Denise, it's been a very strange week in American politics.
Well, every week is a strange week in American politics anymore.
Let's start with what happened in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania State House Speaker's race. Tell us what happened and then why that happened.
Okay, well, it's a good news, bad news situation that we'll start with on election day. The good news, if you're a Democratic partisan, is that the House of Representatives was won, the majority of seats were won by Democrats. But bad news is that 3 of those Democrats, 1 who passed away, and 2, Summer Lee and Austin Davis, who moved on to new jobs, are no longer there. So there's going to be a need for special elections. Under what everyone thought on election day, Joanna McClinton was supposed to be the new Speaker of the House in Pennsylvania. That didn't happen. And part of the reason that didn't happen is because technically the Democrats are down 3 seats. So the Republicans naturally were not going to put McClinton in that seat. And so a compromise was put together, and McClinton is not the Speaker of the House. A Democrat is the Speaker of the House, but it's someone who has said that they are going to be an independent and they're not going to caucus with either side, which I don't know what that means in terms of what happens legislatively. But for a lot of people who were expecting McClinton to be the new Speaker of the House, you either have the folks who understand that this compromise had to be worked out in order for the legislative business of the people to take place, or you have the people who are hoping that once those 3 seats are filled and McClinton becomes the Speaker of the House, that she basically strikes down with righteous vengeance and furious anger against the people who decided that she should not be the Speaker of the House just yet. The person who's the new Speaker is Representative Mark Rossi from Berks County, which, having lived in Berks County, it's going to be interesting to see where he goes. He says he's not going to join the internal deliberations of Republicans or Democrats, but he's the highest ranking member of the House. And according to the state constitution, he's in charge with the chamber, including deciding when to call lawmakers into session. So it's going to be interesting, how he serves as an independent voice and what happens once the general election, once the special elections are held, if he returns to caucusing with the Democrats again, if he remains an independent, or any of the other things that could happen in Pennsylvania politics, like deciding to become a Republican or deciding to leave the state house and become a clown. This is Pennsylvania politics, so nothing is off the table.
Yeah, some would say that many of the politicians become clowns while they're still in office.
And some would say that they were clowns before they got into office.
In some cases, yes. But it's interesting too, and I was less surprised by the fact that there was a compromised candidate, which seems like that's a temporary situation until the special elections happen,
right?
Probably in February. What was more surprising is what you talked about, that he became an independent. I didn't see that coming. That was a little odd. This had happened. There was something similar that had happened about 15 years ago or so, when the Democrats had a 1-seat majority in the state house, and before the speaker's election, the Democrats said, "I'm not voting for our candidate," who at the time was Bill DeWeese, who then later went to federal prison. But so the Democrats scurried and nominated a moderate Republican to be a speaker. It was a very odd situation. And there's shades of that in this, because you had Republicans supporting an erstwhile Democrat anyway, who became an independent. So very interesting. It's something we're going to be keeping an eye on. And in the spring, probably in March, I think things are going to be a little different.
Right. Because part of the reason why Rossi being named Speaker of the House is significant is that Republicans have been trying to make it so the special elections to fill these 3 seats doesn't happen until May. They wanted it to be part of the primary. By putting Rossi in, that guarantees that the special elections will happen in February. So that way, you get closer to what everybody thought was going to happen. Chances are really, really good that once that special election is held and those 3 people that are in Democratic leaning districts are sworn in, they'll take another vote and McClinton will finally make history as the first Black woman to be Speaker of the House. But don't quote me on that, because honestly, again, we're talking Pennsylvania politics. Anything can happen, and it usually does.
Yeah. We've been, I don't know that there's an election night for a Pennsylvania election where we haven't been surprised by something. It's just a strange political world we live in here. Now let's talk about something equally strange. In Washington right now, in Congress, the United States Congress has taken 6 votes to see who will be the Speaker of the House. No one has won yet, and this is the first time in 100 years, exactly 100 years, this has happened. Denise, what are you seeing here?
Well, what I'm seeing is what happens when you go so far with the extremes of your party that, see, what people need to understand about what's currently going on in Washington is that it didn't actually start this time around, and it didn't actually start in 2010 when the Republicans got control of the House. This actually goes back to the 1980s when Reagan was president, and he had the Christian Coalition that was, his bulwark against those bad old liberals that were trying to do stuff like, I don't know, preserve civil rights. Reagan partnered with the Christian Coalition, and the Christian Coalition they've always had these like far, far to the right people that were part of the Republican Party. But under the Reagan administration, they were only allowed to come out when it was time to vote. And then they put them back in the basement and locked up the basement and let them just run around down there. In 2009, in order to get control of the House, John Boehner opened up the door and let them run amok, and they created what was called the Tea Party. A lot of the folks that are currently battling in the House for the House of Representatives, Speaker of the House seat, are people who came into Congress as part of the Tea Party. Kevin McCarthy was one of the people that came in as part of the Tea Party. And he was even endorsed for this position by Donald Trump, who is possibly the best example of what happens when you let something like the Tea Party form that I can come up with. Even with Trump's re-endorsement, McCarthy still hasn't gotten the votes to become Speaker of the House because people like Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene and people even further, Matt Gaetz, and people even further to the right than McCarthy, which is really saying something, are saying, we don't want you to be Speaker of the House. And you also have those few moderate Republicans that are like the January 6th report that basically said the guy that we put in the White House committed treason is starting to freak us out a little bit. So we want some separation. So they proposed another candidate, a gentleman, and let me make sure I get his name right, because I don't want to, mistake names here, but there's a Black gentleman from Florida who is who is competing with McCarthy for the right to be the Speaker of the House. Now he's only gotten like 20 votes or
Mhm.
so to get the office, but it's enough to keep McCarthy from getting it because you need 218 votes. The gentleman's name is Byron Donalds. And you need 218 votes to be Speaker of the House. And right now, the way that McCarthy and Donalds have been splitting up the votes, 20 of the votes that could have gone to McCarthy under normal circumstances have gone to him. And then there's one person that just keeps voting present, meaning that they don't want to, take on any part of this fight. But meanwhile, Representative Hakeem Jeffries, who is the House Minority Leader, has the entire Democratic caucus has voted in lockstep, all 212 of them, to put him in the office. So right now, it's going to be interesting because, as you know, when we turn on C-SPAN at 8:00, we're going to be seeing vote number 7 in the House in the House, the Speaker of the House race. It's going to be interesting to see what happens.
Now, I was thinking about this yesterday. The strategy, okay, you take the first vote, right? Okay, that makes sense. You see where everybody is. Because even if people are posturing, you're still not sure. You take the first vote. You take the second vote to see if it softens up a little bit if you're McCarthy, right? Maybe those 20 people, after the first vote, they made their point. Maybe, right? Then they do the third vote. And that's where I thought, if I'm McCarthy, I'm not so sure I do this. Because if you start losing votes, you're in trouble. He did lose one in that third vote. Then today, they come back and they do the exact same thing, the exact same way, 3 times in a row, and nothing changes in the vote tally. Why? What sense does any of that make?
Larry, the textbook definition of insanity is to do something the exact same way several times and yet expect a different result. And I think that's kind of where we are here. We are in the insanity part of Congress, the game, because you're right. You would think that after 3 times, you'd have gotten a hint. These people are not going to put you in office. So one of two things has to happen. You either have to drop out or you have to find out what they want and what you could possibly give them to get yourself the office. And that hasn't happened yet. Meanwhile, there are rumblings that Republicans are talking to Democrats about possibly seeing if they can pick a few of those off, and the Democrats are like, we're not going to help you out of this mess. And then you have some that are saying, oh, let's go and get Liz Cheney, which I guess could be a good compromise candidate. But the thing is, everybody on the Democratic side realizes that while she was right once, or she came correct once with the January 6th commission, the bottom line is prior to that time, she had voted for everything Donald Trump put up, no matter how outrageous. So I don't know how much of a compromise candidate she would actually be.
She's an arch conservative.
I mean, she's Dick Cheney's daughter. Come on now.
Right. So I feel like the 20 holdouts on the Republican side, it's almost intractable at this point. It doesn't feel like that's going to move.
No.
At least to me. We only have about 30 seconds left. But do you think that there is a possibility of some sort of power sharing coalition?
It's possible, but not probable. Because
I agree.
People who were put in office as Republicans, they have that same Trumpian attitude that led to people dying needlessly from COVID because you had somebody who didn't really want to deal with the disease. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all shakes out, but I don't know if a coalition government is possible here.
All right. We'll have to leave it there. This may be resolved next week. We'll see. Next week on the program, we will have council members Mike Driscoll and Isaiah Thomas. So we'll be back with you next week here on Hall Monitor.